Hi, welcome to our first evening episode of Zionism Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond, Expanding the Conversation. We are so excited that you could join us for this conversation. These sessions are based on a series that we did. They're based on a convening that JTS hosted in October, looking at the idea of Zionism Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond. And we took some of the sessions and kind of evolved and adapted them for an online audience. And we're really excited for tonight's session, which is building on a session that Rabbi Jan Uhrbach hosted and moderated at the convening itself on pluralism. But really, it's this session that I think fits into so much of what we're doing in the world right now. That so much of what we hear about in the world is how divided and how polarized we are. And the question is, and some of those polarizations are in our families, some of those are in our workplaces, and it's this real challenge of how do we talk across divides? How do we bridge the gap? How do we have conversations of import with people we love, respect, maybe just have to tolerate, and live in the same space with, when there's so many fraught, big issues at play in our universe? And we'll be focusing a bit on this in the realm of our Zionism conversation, but I think this is really general, broad advice that can be used in many, many, many different veins and facilities. So as I said, we're delighted to have Rabbi Jan Uhrbach with us. She's the director of the Block Kolker Center for Spiritual Arts. And I'll introduce her with a bit more detail later. I want to welcome any first-time attendees who are here. And I want to take a moment to say that this is, there are many of these programs on YouTube, on our website, and you can watch them. You can watch the rest of this series. We'll post a link to that in the chat. This is the 5th of 6 episodes, and our next session also is will be at this evening hour at 7:30 Eastern. I want to thank our generous sponsors. We have 2 Hacham level sponsors, George A. Goldberg, MD, in loving memory of Janet K. Goldberg and Max J. Goldberg, and Drora and Maddie Shalev. Making a donation is a great way to honor someone like Dr. Goldberg did, or it's a way of just showing your commitment to JTS learning. And there are 3 different sponsorship levels. There's some information on how you can make a sponsorship in the chat. And feel free, while we're ending this series, we'll be having another series in the winter, and we'd love to have you on board as a sponsor. So now, just so you know, like a little bit about our kind of program maintenance, we'll be in conversation with Rabbi Jan Uhrbach. She's going to be introducing the subject. We'll be stopping in the middle for questions and then again at the end. If you have questions, you can send them to me, and I will be curating a conversation with her as we go through this program. And I look forward to seeing what your thoughts are on this kind of on these big issues of how we talk across divides. With that said, we're going to be focused more on the mechanics of how to have these conversations, as opposed to these specific fraught conversations that I'm sure many of us are having in many different forums. So in thinking about Q&A, please consider what are the challenges you have in approaching the conversation, as opposed to the specific nuance of each specific conversation that you're trying to have. I'll be sharing sources on the screen, but we also sent sources in our email, and we'll share a link to those sources if you'd like to have them up on your own screen in the chat. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Rabbi Jan Uhrbach. She is the founding director of the Block Kolker Center for Spiritual Arts. She brings her passion for prayer and teaching to the JTS community. When I started here, she was serving as the interim dean of the Division of Religious Leadership in that school year, and was a tremendous addition in that way. But she also, one of the things she brought as the dean and what she brings into her role as in working with rabbinical students is that she also has a pulpit. She's the founding rabbi of Gesher, the Bridge Shul in Bridgehampton, Long Island. And prior to her life as a rabbi, she was an attorney for many years. So we're just delighted to have Rabbi Uhrbach with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Ellie, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really a pleasure. I want to open just by saying that, I'm not a family therapist, right? I don't have a master's in communication. I'm someone who does a lot of this work and has good experience with it. As a former lawyer, I'm very good at arguing. But as a rabbi, I've learned how to really have nuanced, difficult conversations. And I'll give you just one example off the bat that I'll refer to later. About a year and a half ago, I got into an Uber and was wearing a mask and asked the driver to mask, and he promptly told me, none too kindly, to get out of the cab and take another cab. And I chose to stay, and we began a conversation, and through 45 minutes of rush hour Midtown traffic, we began to talk about some of the similarities that Jews and Muslims share, and got actually pretty open and vulnerable with each other. And what began with get out of the cab ended with him dropping me off, turning around, looking me in the eye, and saying, "Thank you for the conversation." Right? That's doesn't always happen that way, but sometimes it does. What we thought we would do to open this is take 1 minute to ask you to do a little online poll. Literally, this is like a 1 minute, very short poll. And we're going to post it anonymously, and we're going to post the results online so we can see how, as a group, we are experiencing this question of conversations across divides and what the stakes are for us. So we're going to post it now. Just take, 30 seconds to a minute, do the survey, and then we'll look. Can we share the... So you may have to scroll up to see the results. So it looks like about almost half of us feel that it feels pointless to have conversations that are difficult. About a fifth of us are good, don't avoid them. A little more than a third are uncomfortable with tension and anger. We're about almost 50-50 on having lost a significant relationship. A quarter of us have stopped talking to someone. A quarter of us, someone stopped talking to us. And it looks like about a third of us feel that we're open to having conversations across difference and the other side isn't. A strong majority of us feel that these conversations are essential, which is really, right? A majority of us, about half of us, feel that we don't do them because they feel pointless, but 64% of us said they feel essential. That's a really important, some really important data. Okay, so just having a sense now of where we are in the room, I want to look at a couple of sources. We're not going to study them in depth, but it's always good to ground our conversation in what some Jewish texts have to say about these issues. So I gave you just a few sources that are very well known. I'm sure some of you, most of you maybe may be familiar with many of them. The first one is from Masechet Sanhedrin in the Babylonian Talmud. We're sharing the screen. And the text reads, for this reason was the human created alone, right? Adam was the first human being created alone, to proclaim the greatness of the Holy Blessed One. Why? Because if a person strikes many coins from one mold, they all resemble one another. But the supreme sovereign of sovereigns, the Holy Blessed One, fashioned every person in the stamp of the first human, yet no one resembles their fellow. Therefore, every person is obligated to say, the world was created for my sake. Now, what does this teach us? Basically, what I'm bringing this text primarily to make the point that Nurit Novus Deutsch made at the convening on our panel, which is the difference between plurality and pluralism. Right? Plurality is the fact of difference. Pluralism is difference as a value. And this text tells us that difference is actually a value, that the differences among us are highly desirable because they bespeak the greatness of God. That's not a small thing, right? Difference is, from the perspective of this text at least, a good thing. So that's the first text, right? Difference is good. The next text, I think, is a little less well known and perhaps very surprising. And this is a text also from Masechet Sanhedrin that is a text about what happens in capital cases, a death penalty case. I should just say the Sanhedrin never, to our knowledge, actually imposed the death penalty. But theoretically, at least, if there is a death penalty, and the Sanhedrin is entirely unanimous to convict, they have to acquit. What's the reasoning? Because we've learned as a tradition that you have to suspend trial overnight to create a possibility of acquittal. Right? Generally, you can't acquit, you can't convict on the same day that the testimony is given. You have to let the judge sleep on it in case somebody comes up with something to change their mind. But here, since there's unanimous agreement to convict, nobody's going to see any possibility of acquittal. And therefore, we can't trust the verdict. The text then goes on to talk about the requirements to be appointed to the Sanhedrin. And I just want to focus on the last one. Rav Yehuda said in Rav's name, none is to be given a seat on the Sanhedrin unless one is able to prove the cleanness of a reptile from biblical texts. Now, biblical texts explicitly say that a reptile is unclean, right? So unless you are skilled enough to completely argue the other side from what you believe the text says, you have no place in the court. Now, what does this text say, right? This text teaches us that not merely being different is a value, but thinking differently is a value. It is desirable. It helps us access truth. And if everyone agrees, we should be suspicious, right? Full agreement is a problem. It's not a good thing. If everyone votes to convict, we can't trust the decision. Because, right, we may be liable for groupthink. We may be missing something and no one's arguing it for it. So the different thinking is a good thing. Okay, and we'll go to the next one. This is the famous text about the debates between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel that went on for 3 years, with each side arguing that the halacha is in agreement with their own views, and ultimately a bat kol, which is an echo of God's voice, issues an announcement saying, these and these are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim hen, v'halacha kebeit Hillel. But the halacha is according with the world, with the view of Beit Hillel. Why? Not because Hillel is more right, but because they were respectful and kind and modest, and they studied both their rulings and those of Beit Shammai, and they mentioned the other side's opinion before their own. This is the classic, famous text that teaches us a couple of things. One, that competing truths can both be true. These and those are the words of the living God. That's a hard one to hold, that we can both be right and have opposite views. And that the process by which we discuss is essential, right? The respect we accord each other ultimately is what decides the issue, not who's more right. Okay, so with those texts as a foundation, and we'll look at the last one later, a couple of things I want to point out. One is we have to recognize that allowing for difference is different from moral relativism. It doesn't mean that anything goes, right? To say that competing truths can both be right doesn't mean that all statements that everybody makes or all positions that everyone holds are both right all the time. Sometimes there is right and wrong, and certainly that's true of facts. And when we talk about communication across difference, it's worthwhile thinking about what it is we differ about, right? We may differ as to facts. We may differ as to interpretations of facts or the meaning we make from them. We may differ about values, what values we actually have. We may differ about the relative weight we accord different values. We may differ in the emotional valence that we bring to a particular issue. And we may differ about predictions, right? In the broad category of predictions, I want to put things like, this is what Israel needs to do to be secure, right? This is what will lead to peace. This is what is good for the economy, right? The reality is those are predictions about what we think will lead to a certain result. That's different from a fact. Now, in looking at these, we of course have the special problem in our world of misinformation and disinformation, right? Of people who believe things that they've been told that are intentional lies. And that's a very difficult problem when it comes to talking across divides in our world right now, and it relates to everything. What I want to say about that, we'll talk about it a little bit later. There isn't an easy solution to that, obviously. What I do want to say is that we should be aware that even in the best case, none of us is quite as fully informed as we want to think we are. Most of us have consumed something that is false that we didn't realize was false. Most of us have read something that skimmed the surface of an issue, and with that little bit of knowledge, we believe we know a lot, right? That's part of the human condition. That's the first thing. The second thing is none of us is as fully rational as we like to think we are. We're all influenced by all kinds of things, by our past history, by our emotions, by the personal experience, by the mood we happen to be in when we experience something. We all like to think that we are rational actors. Most of the research on cognition reveals that we're not, right? We are all subject to cognitive bias in various ways. So that all bespeaks a need for real humility when we begin to try to have conversations across difference, no matter how right we think we are. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. If we could share the screen again, I want to turn right now to the last text, or the second to last text, the last rabbinic text. This is text number 4. This one is also one that we are very, very familiar with from the Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, about machlochet, about dispute. Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim, will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. And the examples are given. The one for the sake of heaven is the dispute of Hillel and Shammai. The one that is not for the sake of heaven is Korach and his congregation. This is a very rich text. We could talk about this for an hour. We're not going to. I brought it primarily to make the point that the first step when we want to think about how to communicate across difference is to think about and decide on the goal of our conversation, right? And I'm not going to parse tonight what does it mean to have a dispute for the sake of heaven. But I do want to list some of the reasons why we might be engaging in a conversation across difference and talk about the impact of those reasons. So we can unshare for the moment. Being clear on the why am I having this conversation, is essential because it can help keep the engagement productive. And even before that, can help us decide whether or not to engage. So here are some of the reasons why we might have a conversation across difference, right? We might want to convince someone that they're wrong and we're right. We might have the conversation to understand or to learn something. Sometimes we might engage in a conversation because we want to feel right or righteous, or because we want to express anger or demean someone, right? Poke holes in an argument and prove that they're wrong. Sometimes we have these conversations to kind of express team membership and show our team colors, right? To show which side we're on, to take a stand. Or we might have a conversation to build a relationship or deepen one. Sometimes we're engaging in a conversation because there's a particular work that we have to do. We have to solve a problem. We have to make a decision with someone who really disagrees with us. Sometimes it's about litigating the past. And sometimes it's working toward the future. My own feeling, and based on the survey we took, at least 64% of us feel this way, is that it is absolutely essential that we learn how to have hard conversation across difference if there is to be any future. That's true for Israel. It's true for America. It's true for humanity, right? If we do not start talking to each other and understanding each other, there is no path forward. So recognizing, by the way, as I mentioned, litigate the past or work toward the future, there's a difference between litigating the past and remembering the past. We'll talk about that in a minute, right? I'm not saying the past is irrelevant. It has a role. So if the goal is to feel right or express anger or show team colors, maybe don't have the conversation. It's probably not going to lead any place good. If your goal is to convince someone that they are wrong and you are right, or to change someone's mind, we have to be extra careful. Those conversations are only productive in very limited circumstances. They are productive when there is already relationship and trust, and or when you are both open to being convinced. So I wouldn't engage in a conversation and try to change someone else's mind if I know that I'm not open to being changed at all, because that's not a real conversation. That's not real communication. And no one wants to be schooled by someone who isn't listening. It's not likely to lead anyplace good. But if the goal is to understand or to learn or to deepen or build a relationship, that's your sweet spot. And I would say that the best chance we have of actually influencing someone and changing their mind is when our goal is, in fact, to learn and understand and have a relationship, to humanize each other to each other. The byproduct is we may have a chance at changing minds, and our mind may be changed too. We can learn something, but it has to be real. It can't be that we're going into the conversation saying, listen, I just want to understand, when our real goal is to convince, because it's transparent. Everyone knows. I'm sure many of us have been on the other side of that, right? I really just want to understand what you have to say, when in fact, we're feeling browbeaten into, trying to defend a position. So this step requires real discernment and radical honesty with ourselves. Why am I doing this? What is my goal? Am I interested in the other person? Am I open to hearing? And then it requires a good memory in the heat of the moment, when things get hard, when we hear something that triggers us. Why am I having this conversation? Right? Why am I doing this? If I remember, because this is someone I love and I want a real relationship with them. If I remember, it's because I feel that the only way to have a future is if we start talking to each other, then I can stay on track and not get hooked. The next piece of discernment that we need to do with these conversations, and then we'll break and have some questions, and then I want to talk about some really specific techniques. The next piece of discernment is whether or not to engage now. Is this a good time for this conversation? For me and for the other person? Or is it not? Are we both calm? Or is one of us activated, frightened, angry, anxious, grieving? That is not a good time for a conversation. Do we have time to really talk? Right? We don't want to raise a hot button issue on the fly when we have 5 minutes between something. We want to be able to really have a conversation. And who else is there? Right? Will someone feel ganged up on or too vulnerable? Are there others present whose presence would make admitting uncertainty or error difficult, or who create posturing? For this reason, for example, wanting to have a conversation, just randomly picking a thought, with a grandchild about Zionism and anti-Zionism, maybe a large family dinner table is not the best context. Take a walk, just the two of you. It's a very different conversation when no one else is listening, right? And that conversation can open with, I want to have a real relationship with you, and I want to understand your position here, and I want us to be able to talk about anything, just the two of us, right? So that's the second piece of discernment. The first is, why am I having this conversation? And the second is this a good time to do it? And if it's not an immediate family member, if it's not someone we're in an ongoing relationship, the third piece of discernment is this a good person to have this conversation with? Is this person open? Are they on board? Right? Is this someone that I want to invest in having the conversation with? All right, so let me stop there and we'll see if any questions have come up.
I have a couple. I have lots of, can you make sure can you send us the strategies after? Can you include those in the sources? And I said we would come up with a sheet for this. But one question is, I think, a quick, is there a that goes back to the capital punishment question. Is capital punishment okay? Can rabbis support capital punishment? I know in the Torah there are lots of mentions of you can stone people in this, but isn't that kind of a no-fly zone anyway?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wanted to make sure to say that it was basically a hypothetical, right? The Sanhedrin never imposed the death penalty, and they were absolutely against it, saying that, you know, a Sanhedrin that imposed the death penalty once in 70 years was a harsh court, and then they ratcheted it up once in 700 years, right? Like, no, right? That's not, basically no. It's not really our topic today, but yeah, it's the discussion of the capital cases in the Talmud is largely hypothetical. Yeah.
The second is going, and I think it kind of bridges into both of the section we just were in and the section we're about to do. So after the election, this person's rabbi was talking about in their sermon about the breakdown of the percentage of people who voted one way or the other, and felt that 30% voted in a significant portion for the other candidate. I'm going to leave this very vague and open in this moment. And the questioner says they feel incredibly strongly that the rabbi is encouraging the entire congregation to cooperate and to come together and deal with each other in kindness. The questioner feels very strongly that they cannot do this and that they don't want to do this. They can be civil, but they're just not interested in this other 30%. They feel bad, but that's how they feel. And then their sense, and this goes back to, I think, that question of how do you even figure out that you're ready to embark on the conversation, is the feelings of anger that are just there, and anger with his fellow congregants, his fellow Jews, and you know, knowing that you have to make a kehillah. How do you work to find points of cooperation?
Yeah. So this is why it's so hard, right? And you know, these conversations about difference, they're not that hard when the differences don't feel like, in some way, existential threats or threats to something that is really core to who we are, right? And that's the realm in which a lot the biggest issues that we're struggling with right now sit. And one of the reasons why I think it is so essential that we sort of manage our reactivity and screw up our courage and have these conversations is because that anger and resentment has no place to go and will never be resolved unless we actually start talking to people about why they make the decisions they do and take the positions they take and vote for who they vote for and advocate for what they advocate for. And instead, we imagine in our own heads who they are and what led them to their conclusions, and we judge very harshly. Now, there may be times when we ask the questions and we discover that our worst judgments about another person are in fact confirmed, right? That sometimes happens. There are people who make decisions for very venal reasons or out of hate, right? That does happen. But I don't think it's the majority of the time, right? And people are complex. And most people have very complex stories when we drill down into why they're acting the way they are. So I think that that question of, I'm angry and I have no interest, right? That's the discernment piece that says, I'm not ready to have these conversations. Don't have them from that place. But that doesn't mean that's the place we want to stay. Because if we stay in that place, there is no future. That's the problem. I mean, if you think about the history just of American elections in the last several election cycles, who is happy and who is served by these vitriolic, completely divided, existential, right? Everything is to the death elections every 2 or 4 years, in which every 4 years, half the country is celebrating and half the country is devastated and terrified. Like, what is the future in that? Think about the drain on our resources, on our emotions, on our money, on our energy, the human cost of all that vitriol, right? Like, and that's just one example. You think about like personal relationships and the cost of not being able to talk to each other. So my own experience is that the times that I have taken the risk to have a conversation with someone that I judged very harshly, it has paid off pretty much 99% of the time. Not 100%, but 99%.
Still a great percentage. I think if any of us could do something 99% of the time, we'd be delighted with that.
Yeah, because what I discover is people are richer and more complex than the one thing I knew about them, which is they voted in some way, or they hold a position I disagree with, or they went to a protest that I found offensive, right? So that gets us into the specific strategies. And
let's jump into that.
Yeah. So the first thing is that to have a productive question and conversation, and most of these strategies have to do with creating a sense of safety, right? Because these conversations involve vulnerability on both sides. You can't have real communication without being vulnerable, right? And so people have to feel safe enough to get real a little bit. So one obvious strategy that I hope almost everyone has heard before is that it always helps to speak in I statements rather than you, right? This is, I believe, I feel, I'm hearing, this is what I think about. Another thing, and this is, I'm going to start with some low-hanging fruit, very simple things, especially in a conversation with a family member or someone you really care about. This may sound trite, but it's really important. Agree on a safe word that will end the conversation. That if someone is feeling attacked, if someone is feeling that it has gotten, they are too far out there, they are too emotional, they can't have this conversation anymore, that whatever the word is, anybody says that word, the conversation is over. We say we love each other. End of discussion for now. It doesn't mean the conversation is over forever, right? But it allows people to know that they have an out if they're feeling bullied or attacked or just cornered and uncomfortable, right? So that's an important piece. The biggest piece is that the most effective communication is communication on the emotional level, not on the factual level, not on the policy level, not on the, it's about the things that we love and value and the things that we fear. When you can get there, things open up. And the best way to get there is to lead with that, right? When it's a very different conversation when we open up about our fears. And very often what we discover is that it's not actually a difference in values. It's a difference in what we fear. I have a couple of my congregants who I know we disagree 100% politically, 100%. And the main difference is what we fear. Our primary fears are different, whether we fear, anti-Semitism coming from Christian nationalism and Nazism on the right, or whether we fear anti-Semitism coming from radical Islam or coming from, extremists on the left, right? It's the fears that drive the difference. Once we understand that, we can talk about almost anything, right? So learning to have the conversation on the level of emotions is really important. And that means opening with our own emotions and the willingness to be vulnerable. I now have a very good relationship with a couple of Islamic colleagues where my congregation is. And the reason I have that relationship is because we were together for an interfaith Thanksgiving service last year, about 2 weeks, maybe 3-4 weeks after October 7th. And the service itself was a little tense. But we were, as clergy, all smiles and warm and happy. And after the service, I approached these two colleagues and I said, look, I just feel like we can't be here at this Thanksgiving service with big smiles, telling each other how grateful we are and how nice everything is, without acknowledging that we are all heartbroken and terrified and really angry. And I just wanted to acknowledge that with you. What it opened was extraordinary. Just naming feelings. We never talked about who's right. We never talked about about October 7th. But what we did acknowledge is that both I and my community and this imam and his community were terrified. And that was important. It shifted something. So, emotional statements. The second really powerful tool is narrative, storytelling. What is your story that leads you to believe what you think? I've had wonderful conversations with people by asking that question and listening, right? This is part of the key. The main skill for communication across difference isn't about what we say and how we say it. It's not about talking. It's about listening. And it's especially about listening to stories and drawing out commonalities from those stories and values and experiences that we share, and lifting up and naming the common feelings, right? The moment we can say, I can understand how you would feel that way. I had a similar kind of experience. I came to a different conclusion, but I understand. Then you're in a real conversation, right? Then you can actually talk across difference and be able to humanize and respect each other. So drawing out narratives, and this is, one big strategy for these conversations is come prepared with good questions. And one of the best questions is, what experience in your life led you to that belief? Right? Once you ask that and the person tells their story, there's an opening now for you to tell your story. And I would recommend asking before telling, because when we think about our own experience, right, it's very hard to want to hear someone else's narrative and pain until our own is acknowledged. When our own story is heard and someone recognizes and acknowledges our pain, it's much easier to hear about someone else's. So we can take the lead and listen first. And that opens the door to someone hearing our own. Some other good questions. I had a friend and congregant who is a management consultant who taught me one of the best questions that I have ever heard. And the question is, can you be influenced? Can you be influenced? If the answer is no, the answer is no. And it's a great question to ask oneself. Can I be influenced here? Right? Maybe no. Maybe not right now, maybe never. Maybe this is a core belief that I will never change. That doesn't mean I can't still have a conversation across difference. But now I understand I'm not looking to influence or be influenced. That's not happening because neither one of us is open to that. Right? It's a great question. Can you be influenced? And it's a real question that demands a real answer and some thoughtfulness. Am I open to being influenced? Another question that I love is, with what percentage of certainty do you hold that belief? This is what I think Israel should do. This is what I think is best for America. With what percentage of certainty do I hold that belief? Asking oneself and asking the other. It's rarely 100%. Now we're open to talking about our doubts. Right? What makes me question what I believe? Why isn't that number 100%? What am I less sure about? That's where there's possibility of real conversation. Yes, I have that question. I believe this, but I worry about this. You believe this, but you worry about that. We may not actually be that far apart. Right? We both have certain doubts. And we hold with different percentages. Now maybe we can understand each other. Another very fruitful question, what would convince you otherwise? I had a recent conversation with a neighbor who we are absolutely, completely opposites on politics. And he was telling me there was something that I believe firmly is true and has been proven, and he does not. And I asked him, okay, well, this is the evidence that's been adduced so far for this. You're not convinced by that. What would you need to hear to believe that this is true? That's a very different way of having a conversation than how could you not see with everything that, all the proof that's there? What would convince you if this doesn't? The answer I got to that question was, oh, I actually have to think about that. Now there's movement, right? Now we're actually engaging in a real conversation. And always clarifying questions are terrific. What did you mean when you said X, right? How are you using that term? What does Zionism mean to you? What does anti-Zionism mean to you? Right? We may be having discussions across difference because we're not even using the terms the same way. And by asking, we're showing that we're actually interested and we want to hear and we want to learn. Right? So those kinds of questions are really important. The next level down, and this gets really hard, is acknowledging what is hard and threatening to the other. right? We are, almost all of us, like we're very aware of what pushes our buttons, what makes us scared, what threatens our maps of meaning of the world, what is really, what makes us feel unmoored in some way, what's terrifying. It is really important to recognize that sometimes the thing that is my map of meaning makes another person terrified. And when I acknowledge that, we can have conversations, right? Now, that may mean just listening and hearing and acknowledging, yeah, I hear that my position on X is really threatening to you because of Y. I get that. That alone changes the tone of the conversation. Right? And that, but it's really hard. And what it may mean, and what it often means, is giving up the idea that we are going to convince someone else to share our worldview, or even to share our values or the way we weight those values. But we can nevertheless get together to solve problems, to work toward a shared vision of how we can both be in the world. And it's hard work, and it requires real patience and courage and great vulnerability. One of the things that gives me the courage is when I remember the cost of not doing it. And whether that's the cost in terms of personal relationships or the cost of religious integrity, what happens to a faith when we can't have certain conversations in a faith community because they're too hard? There's a huge cost to that. What happens to a nation when we can't talk about the things that really trouble us? What happens to a family, right? So I'll share with you where I started, what turned the conversation with this particular Uber driver. It started with this very hostile debate about COVID, which he said he didn't even believe was real. And then I drilled down a little bit, like, well, what do you not believe is real? Do you not think COVID exists, or do you not think it's serious? Right. And he kept telling me his positions, and I kept asking follow-up questions. And we solved the immediate problem by just opening the window, right? I was masked, he wasn't. We opened the window. I was happy with that. What turned the conversation was the question of what would convince you otherwise? He was very resentful of the vaccines. He didn't believe them. And I asked him, like, what is it that you don't, you take aspirin when, you take other drugs that are supported by medical science. What is it about this that you don't believe? And I had to ask the question 5 different times before he really heard what I was asking. And finally, he said, well, those drugs have been around for a really long time. And this is where listening is important. So I took what he said and I said, oh, are you saying that you feel the vaccines were rushed to market and that there wasn't adequate research, and that scares you? And he said, yes. I said, well, I can understand that. That's not an unreasonable position. The whole conversation changed. Right? Right there, the whole tone changed, the conversation changed. And from there, we were able to talk about, what he thinks about health and how his religion comes into play and how my religion comes into play. And it was extraordinary. And it was that question that turned it, but it required persistence. So the last thing I wanted to share with you, which is very brief, and then we'll have a little time for questions. I gave you just on the last piece of the last text, is something we developed for our interfaith Thanksgiving service this year. because we wanted to open up this discussion, this idea of the importance of really hearing each other. And so we created a litany that the Christians do, where usually they have a litany where the clergy reads something and then the congregation responds. And this, we asked everyone in the room to turn to a neighbor and say this to the person next to them, and then hear it, and then switch sides and have the person next to them say it back. And this is the litany that we ask people to say. This sacred earth is our home. This precious nation and East End community is where we live. I need to be safe and have my basic needs met. You need to be safe and have your basic needs met. I yearn to belong, to love, and be loved. You yearn to belong, to love, and be loved. My fate is intertwined with yours. Your fate is intertwined with mine. Let these realities move us to value one another and live in peace as we preserve the earth, this nation, and our community. Right? That's what we had people say. And then we talked about what it felt like to say those words to someone and to hear them. They're a good starting point for a hard conversation. So we have just a couple of minutes. I'm happy to stay later if people have questions, but are there questions pending? Lots.
Of course, there are questions pending. And thank you so much. I think you provide such a comprehensive framework for understanding. And I think this idea of coming with questions and vulnerability is really like a good grounding exercise in thinking about the people we want to connect with and how we connect with them. One person is just commenting that Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, if you haven't read it, is an excellent resource for understanding those who are different. So, this is
1,000%. It's terrific.
It's a great book rec, and I would turn it over to the community as well. This one is an interesting kind of process question, that not all conversations that we're having in this universe are individual one-on-one conversations. And a lot of times it's, that you're working in a group dynamic where you're trying to make a decision, and there are, and the person says, there are uncomfortable constraints that both parties can see as a win or at least acceptable, and that decision will become widely known, subjecting one or both parties to criticism. Like whatever comes out of this conversation, someone could be left as the loser. What guidance applies when the parties in conversation are part of this kind of broader network? Like how do you work in those universes?
Yeah, so there's two levels there, right? There's how do you have the conversation in the working group that you're in, and then there's how do you communicate it to the larger group of shareholders who may be judgmental or feel left out by the decision that is made. It's very challenging. And here I think, the question of all of this, first of all, is contextual, right? It depends on how well you know each other and how much time you have to work together and the relationships that you've built up. I do think that there is a real value when you are making hard decisions that are fraught in some way, where there are kind of sides, where it's likely that someone will feel like a winner or a loser, to open the conversation with a go round of, what our values are in making this decision, and maybe even some of the emotional stakes that we have in it, right? And recognizing that it would be desirable if everyone walks away feeling like both a winner or a loser, and that there isn't a winner take all, that if we want a future together, we need to work together, right? And, there, I think also it's recognizing that we don't have to convince everyone at the table to share our worldview. What we have to do is create a situation where people feel safe enough that their worldview will be respected, that the map of meaning they make of the world will not be taken away from them. Nobody's looking to try to turn them into someone they're not. And then we can come and try to solve practical problems, right? That we don't use practical problems as a proxy for like existential battles, right? That we bracket the like but we understand that our worldviews are really different. And neither one of us is going to try to manipulate the other into agreeing with our, like accommodating our worldview. But we have a practical problem here to solve. And can we do it in a way that makes everybody feel that their biggest fears are taken into account and managed, and their most important values are respected? Right? Like that's the frame. And in order to do that, we have to talk about what our biggest fears are and what our most important values are that are at stake in this question, and then find a way. Like that's the best I can do. Then there's the communication outward where to the extent that some of that can be communicated, we recognize that people fear X, Y, and Z. We recognize that people value A, B, and C. And this is the best accommodation we can make to, manage those fears and uphold those values.
I think that again, it provides an excellent framework for starting and developing kind of trust in a group. One of the challenges that our viewers are pointing out is that we live in a society where being vulnerable is often seen as weakness. And many of us have been trained out of vulnerability. And so how in a world in which, you're told, you're supposed to be strong, weakness, any show of weakness is something that you should not have. How do we get to a place where we can start with vulnerability, or at least own our vulnerability?
Yeah. Look, I think this is one of the biggest problems with our society right now, right? This is like the heart of the issue. And, look, it takes both discernment and courage, right? You can't be vulnerable in a way that makes you unsafe, right? There are situations where it's not appropriate to be vulnerable and one can't. You have to pick your settings. On the other hand, I think we often overestimate the cost of vulnerability, right? And we underestimate the cost of this ethos where to be vulnerable is weakness, because what it costs us ultimately is our humanity. Right. I mean, then we end up in relationships where we're not actually real with each other, and there's a lot of posturing, and we make foolish decisions because everyone's afraid to admit that they're unsure that they made a mistake, and it's not a very functional group. So this is a very big topic. There are management consultants that talk about like how one can learn to manage up in this way and like slowly, gently shift a culture toward greater vulnerability. But my sense is that, I mean, outside of sort of very like rigid cultures, and even in some situations where that's the case, very often people are enormously relieved when it becomes possible to admit doubt, or it becomes possible to admit fear. Because we're all human. It's a fantasy to think that anyone has no doubt about what they're doing. That's a fantasy. No human being is without doubt about, and we look at a world like this and in the intractable complexity of the problems that we have, like what thinking person could be 100% sure of what's right, what's the right thing to do if with any of the problems we face. So I don't have an easy like one, two, here are the steps to do that. But I do think that dipping one's toe in a little bit and testing the waters in small ways can subtly shift culture. And, like taking a risk of revealing something that isn't maybe the most vulnerable thing that, either you would feel completely devastatingly exposed if it wasn't respected, or that you would likely lose the confidence of the person you work for and get fired, right? Something a little less high stakes than that. And certainly in a leadership role, when you're in a position to manage, modeling that kind of vulnerability is hugely powerful. Yeah. That's the best I can do, sort of on
No, I
one
think
foot.
that's such an excellent place to kind of close, because I think it is really the sense of how do we put ourselves out there in the world, and what are the ways, in the small ways we can do it, even if it's not us, having these intense conversations, but getting into a universe where we can maybe be prepared for it.
Right.
As one of our listeners said, one of the biggest challenges is the human tendency to face that he or she is stupid or made a wrong assumption, like that, just knowing that maybe we don't know everything, that we're not all, that we're not perfect in the world. And we can own that and admit that, especially with someone who thinks differently than us. That's a real challenge. But
I would just add, another way to think about it is like, what's the worst that could happen? Right? What's the worst that could happen? And if the stakes really are just someone will yell at me, like I'll take the risk of having a discussion with this Uber driver and he'll just yell at me and it won't go anywhere. Okay, that would be unpleasant. But I think if we remember, that we're all human beings, and people who are that angry are usually in pain, then I would have gotten out of the Uber and said, wow, like that person must be like what he must be living with to be that angry over something like this, right? And I take a hot shower and let it go, right? What's the cost, really? But sometimes one discovers, as I did in that moment, someone who really was happy to be vulnerable and didn't know how to get there.
Well, Rabbi Uhrbach, as always, this is a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think that this felt prescriptive in many ways. And I very much appreciate your willingness to, even though, as you kept saying, you're like, but I'm not really an expert, but you provide such a practical way of applying these tools, and really your framework is excellent. So thank you. Next week, we're going to go a little bit deeper into this framework by talking with Chancellor Emeritus Arnie Eisen and two recent alumni, Maya Zinko and Aaron Levin, about their experiences in congregations, but particularly looking at challenges specifically with the idea of the Hanukkah story and the contemporary kind of parallels you can draw with Israel and Israel education. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation. We hope you'll come back again, 7:30 at night. And we hope we'll see you then. Thank you so much and have a lovely evening.
Thank you all.